You're listening to the Journey Podcast. Is it possible to not only heal through trauma, but to thrive along this healing journey? We learn more about post-traumatic growth in this episode. Some listeners may be triggered by this content, and listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. Trauma affects people in different ways. In some cases, trauma breaks survivors, freezes them in place, and shatters their lives into a million pieces they're not able to heal. Other times, trauma survivors are able to move through these ordeals, begin their healing, and actually thrive with post-traumatic growth. What determines who survives and who thrives? In today's episode, we meet Nichole Myles, an expert companion who has moved from survivorship to thrivorship through her own lived experience. One important factor is providing education on what trauma is and advocating for trauma-informed support services. Another important factor is helping trauma survivors realize the possibility of post-traumatic growth to foster their own healing and thrivorship. Bringing forward more than 20 years of experience in education, nonprofits, and leadership, Nichole weaves together compelling storytelling with experience and expertise to engage listeners in a journey of self-discovery, the ups and downs of growth, and what it takes to come back from trauma. Having gone from a traditional upper middle class life to losing everything, living in domestic violence shelters, and having to rebuild an entire life while raising 3 children, Nichole doesn't just speak about post-traumatic growth, she's lived it. Nichole carries a CAGS in nonprofit management, a certified fundraising executive designation, a diversity, equity, and inclusion certificate, and 2 levels of professional certifications in trauma and resilience. Her master's in organizational psychology with a coaching and consulting concentration is expected early 2023. She uses her education to hone poignant personal stories into opportunities for participants to glean critical steps to their own growth, to examine what they've overcome, and how to lean into that experience to amplify their futures. Nichole works as an expert companion in the position of speaker, facilitator, consultant, or coach, helping move clients from survivorship to thrivorship. Let's meet Nichole Myles. Hi, Nichole. It's so great to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because trauma and resilience are such important topics for holistic healing and mental well-being. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Petra, for having me. I am so excited to be here on the journey to talk to you about those really important topics. I think we have a lot to speak about and a lot of ways that we can help people along their journey.
Yes, absolutely. And to start, do you want to share a little bit about yourself? I know that you have a very powerful story, so I'll just let you talk about that and bring that out to the listeners.
Sure, of course. So I am Nichole Myles, and I am currently the owner and founder of Myles to Go Speaking and Consulting. And we are a boutique speaking and consulting business specializing in trauma and resilience and something called post-traumatic growth. And I came to this place largely because of my own personal backstory as a domestic abuse survivor. Several years ago, while I was 8 months pregnant, I had my last and final sort of run-in with escaping from my violent marriage. Like many people, I went back and forth, leaving and then returning about 6 times. And one evening, now about 14 years ago, there was a knock on my door. and there were two police officers on the other side of it who informed me that there was a credible threat on my life and basically said they could not make me leave my home, but they really, really encouraged me to. And I was 8 months pregnant and had other small children, was very worried, but that was enough of a jolt to get me to finally leave permanently. And I went into hiding that night. I spent the next 14 or so months living in shelters, ultimately being homeless, losing my career, my finances, even my name was changed. Sort of everything upended for me. And at the end of that period of time, I had to rebuild an entire life. I was in my mid-30s and I couldn't go back to my career. I couldn't go back to the life I'd known, the community I'd built, the church or the home I had, and I just start all over again. I really fumbled and struggled for a lot of years trying to get back on my feet, but fortunately I did. For the sake of my children and for the sake of myself, I worked really hard, but I made a lot of errors and eventually found myself in a nonprofit executive leadership role, really feeling like I'd accomplished some things in my life, had gotten some things back on track. And as I would explain to people my backstory, they would all say the same thing, which was, you needed to tell the story. You need to tell this story. But I didn't really want to do that because I felt like it was just a story about trauma. However, during the pandemic, I discovered an article in the Harvard Business Review by a man named Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who was reviewing some work he had done in the 90s on something called post-traumatic growth. And what he had done was studied the two different groups of people who experienced traumas. And in the US, it's 70% of adults who will experience a trauma. So that's 237.4 million people in their lifetime. And he was really looking at the two groups, those that get stuck and limited by their trauma and those that grow and develop from their trauma. And at this point in my life, I had really felt like I had grown and developed from my trauma, but I couldn't articulate it. And when I discovered this study of post-traumatic growth, I became so excited and realized that that was the story I wanted to tell. It was how I had recovered, because it turned out that I had followed pretty much step for step this research, even though I didn't know it existed. So I built a framework around this research. I actually reached out to Dr. Tedeschi to talk to him about it. And I joined the ranks of what he had described in that article as something called an expert companion, which are people who have experienced traumatic setbacks and have rebuilt their lives. And that is now the story that I'm telling.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that you speak about that and that you put out this information and the hope for other people who might be going through the same thing and who may be at different places in their journey, experiencing maybe the beginning or the end of what's happening. And maybe they are trying to change or leave. And this is so inspirational that you're telling your story. So thank you so much for that.
It's been a great gift.
Yeah, absolutely. And the bravery, also the strength that you talk about that and that you put this information out there. I appreciate that so much. So thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit about two components that tie into trauma as well. And for me, that would be resilience and self-care. And how do you, first of all, like, what are those two things? And how do we do those things and why do we need them when we talk about trauma?
Resilience and self-care are so important and I think so widely misunderstood, Petra, especially as marketing has kind of glommed on to this term self-care. Along the way of my journey, I picked up 2 levels of professional certification in trauma and resilience because I really wanted to study these subjects. And the way I separate self-care and resilience is a little bit like I would look at an athlete to say training and maintenance. So training is something that athletes have to do every day, right? They have to do a little bit of training every day. You have to stay in your form. This is what has to happen if you're going to be competitive and at your best. And that is really self-care for me. Self-care is the thing we have to do every day. It doesn't have to be a major thing, but to keep us as well as we can be, we have to do something that I determine self-care as being only about you You are the only beneficiary of it, and it doesn't cause you any existential or actual dread. And so what I mean by that is, we see this in marketing, this idea that you need to spend hundreds of dollars and go to a spa day, a 6-hour spa day, and that should be self-care. But if in truth you are struggling financially, which often happens if we're having traumas, right? Because traumas can set us back in a number of ways.
Mhm.
But also, if you've now left your work or you've left things unfinished, you get out of that spa day and you don't feel refreshed because now you're worried about all the things you didn't do. That's not self-care because you're now feeling the dread of what you did instead of the benefits of what you've had. Self-care also has to be a place for you to actually regulate and feel what's happening for you. So sometimes we also think self-care has to make us feel good, and it doesn't necessarily. So I say there's the self-care that you do where you watch your favorite show or your favorite movie because it gives you a good ugly cry and you needed that release. That's great self-care, actually. Even though you're feeling maybe some emotions you've traditionally thought of as negative, if it's helping you release, that's great. If you are watching that film or you're watching television for hours on end to numb yourself out, that is also not self-care. So it has to be about being present. It doesn't have to be expensive and it doesn't have to be long. I'm in the process of kind of crowdsourcing a list of people with my Facebook group and my email list of things we're calling self-care for under 5 minutes or under $5. What are the kinds of things that you can do for you, only for you, and completely unique to you? For me, one of my best self-care little mini sessions is I like to be alone in my car. My car is a really safe, comfortable place for me to be. And I like to be there. And so when I need a break, I can play my favorite music and sit in my car for 5 or 10 minutes and I feel a lot better. And I can make time for that every day. So that's the self-care piece. The resilience piece is a little bit different. You can use self-care things as resilience. But resilience is really how we come back from what has happened to us, how we get to our feet, so to speak. And I used to use this little metaphor about a boat when I explained resilience to people. But I had a little moment a couple of months ago where sort of life imitated art instead of art imitating life. And so I'll explain this a little bit. But I do want to say about resilience also that resilience and self-care both are the beginnings of our journey to healing and growth. They are not the end. And too often we look at resilience as the place we are needing to try to get. And when we get there and we demonstrate resilience, or when a group of people demonstrates resilience, we decide they're done. Like that's the accomplishment. They're resilient. And I'll explain to you in a minute why that's a really bad idea and why if you've found yourself being resilient over and over again, you're thinking, why am I not getting any better? It's because you're not actually on your journey yet. You just keep getting to your feet. So here's what happened with the boat. A couple of months ago, I took my now teenage son, who was the child I was pregnant with when I escaped, my thriving teenage son, to a little mini vacation before school started. If you have adolescent children, you know there's not a lot that they like to do with you, but we both like to kayak, my son and I, and we don't get a ton of opportunity to do it, but we're pretty good. So I decided I was going to sign us up on this trip for something called whitewater kayaking. And in my defense, it was listed as for everybody. So I felt pretty good because we're pretty good kayakers. And we showed up at this place. And like the first thing that happened is that they gave us helmets. So I was a little nervous because helmets and kayaking had not been a thing I'd done together. And then they showed us the kayaks had roll straps. And I realized we might be in for a little bit more of a journey than I thought we had initially signed up for. This is a 7-mile whitewater kayaking journey. They gave us our quick training, loaded us in the little van, drove us down, and literally dropped the two of us in the river and said, go to the end, to the 7 miles, and you'll find the dock and you can get out. So we did because we were there. And about a mile in, we hit our first sort of major rapids. We'd hit some small ones and managed them along the way. It's a little bumpy. This is fairly shallow water with a lot of rocks and good current. But we came to the first major little whitewater section, and my son didn't hit the pathway right, and he beached his kayak on a rock. That in and of itself meant he was pretty well stuck. in a rapid with a lot of water. And that would have been a challenge. However, his kayaking partner, i.e. me, was traveling way too close behind him, and I could not get out of the current. So when he beached his kayak, I ended up T-boning him with my kayak and dumping him out into the rapid below this rock. So this is a trauma. This is a trauma in action, right? It's unexpected. You didn't know it was happening. Maybe it came from a source you weren't expecting. And now my son is in the rapids. The kayak is upside down. The water is flowing around him. The paddle has gone elsewhere. And he's pretty much in shock, which is also what happens to us in a trauma. Yeah. And he does what you would expect and what many of us do, which is he's reaching for the tools that have helped him before. In this case, the kayak, which is upside down. However, in the upside down kayak, the rapid threatens to suck you under, and that would be very, very dangerous. So I'm now yelling from the top of my beached kayak on the rock, get on your feet, get on your feet. I know I can't help him and get out because if I do, my kayak's going to go over the edge and potentially hit him. So all I can do is yell, get on your feet, because that's what he needs to do. And when he finally settles down and realizes he can no longer reach the paddle, he cannot use the kayak, he manages to get his feet underneath him and he stands up. And now the emergency is over. He has done what he needs to do to get on his feet. That is resilience. And it means that the worst of things is over and pretty much you're back where you started. But if you think about this, he's still in the water with an upside down kayak and an oar that's not near him. This is what happens with resilience. We leave people in the water too often. We let them struggle and fight to get to their feet. And then that's the end of the journey, except it's not. We had 6 more miles of kayaking to do, and we had to get back in our boat. And so when I talk about resilience with people, I want to be clear that resilience is a tool to get you back on your feet, but it is not the tool that's going to help you complete your journey. It's just going to give you the opportunity to start it. It's very important. It's fundamental that you get on your feet, right? You can't do anything else until you do, but it isn't over. And I wish as a community we weren't leaving people so frequently. We see this with natural disasters. We see this with people who've had major health crises. We certainly see it in my area with domestic abuse, where we get people to their feet and then we send them out and we think it's okay. It's not. But you do need to develop your resilience. And so in order to do that, we use a lot of the same skills we use in self-care, but we learn to listen to our bodies. We learn to listen to when we're feeling that trauma or trigger. And then we do the things that we know are good for us to help us get to our feet. So again, whether that is 5 minutes of putting your feet in the water, if you happen to be near it, or whether it is meditation or deep breathing, if that works for you, or whether it's doing something like going to a batting cage and releasing that anger, or watching your favorite movie and making you cry. It's that resilience piece of taking a minute, registering where you are, finding a new tool, and getting to your feet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. I think that is the best and most in-depth explanation of resilience that I have heard, because that really puts in context actually also the difference between self-care and resilience, which are sometimes kind of almost used together. So fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that.
That was my pleasure. I think you're right about that. I think we're using those words interchangeably because we don't have a good understanding of either one of them. And because of the tools themselves can be interchangeable, but the application and use of them are very, very different. Yeah. And I think that's the important part for people to know about being resilient. And I think it's really important to know that if you are listening and you've had the trauma and you're wondering like, why haven't I gotten better yet? I'm so resilient. You absolutely are resilient. And you've gotten to your feet, but we have to keep you moving forward. We have to grow now. That's what happens next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your story, you talked a little bit about trigger, for example, the incident that happened with the kayak that both of you weren't prepared for. So when a trigger like that happens, What could a potential trauma response look like for a person? You touched a little bit on shock that could happen. And what are some other things that you've seen or experienced that people could be going through as they're experiencing a trauma response?
Yeah, I love that question because I think people have such a limited viewpoint, often based in media or television, as to what a trauma response looks like. And a lot of people are familiar with the terms fight or flight. There's actually 4 trauma responses, though. People are less familiar with freeze and fawn, which is the newest one that's been added. And interesting things about trauma responses to actual inaction trauma and also to triggers or to vicarious trauma, which is witnessing someone else's trauma. Inside our brains, all of those traumas look exactly the same from a neuropathway point of view. This is how we stayed alive as prehistoric humans, right? We saw a bear and we saw the bear attack someone and we ran from the bear, and that neuropathway lit up and taught us bear is bad, we have to run. Then we learned that if we saw bear prints, the neuropathway in our brain lit up the exact same way, because now we don't have to wait for the bear to attack, right? We run. We know what we need to do. And eventually, then we heard about a bear attack in another village. That same neuropathway lights up in our brain, and we think we have to run. We have to get away from this. And so those trauma responses are quite literally ingrained in our very humanity from the beginning of time. But we get our specific responses, our fight, our flight, our freeze or fawn responses, often in childhood, often as young as 6 to 9. And so we didn't have control over how we responded. And a lot of people recognize the fight response, although they don't recognize it with empathy. That response of somebody responding really aggressively or sarcastically, answering a question with a question, being difficult or destructive. That's a typical fight response, even in a trauma or a triggered situation. Flight people really do want to leave. They really want to get out of the room, which means that they will negotiate in any way necessary to do it. So in the case of something like an abusive situation or, an aggressive situation where they've been abused, they are often willing to say or do whatever they have to end that situation quickly. You'll see that a lot in the way that they respond. In a freeze response, and we saw a freeze response, I think, illustrated really dramatically and sadly during the Supreme Court hearings with Chief Justice Brett Kavanaugh in the US, where he was accused of sexual assault by a woman named Christine Blasey Ford. And one of the things that happened was that she was questioned repeatedly about why she could not remember the details of the specific night or who she was with or what she was wearing. You see this happen a lot. And in a freeze response, that's your brain's reaction to saying, this is too much to handle. I'm shutting this down right now. And so an amnesia response is actually really typical in a freeze response. In a fawn response, fawn responders are the people who sort of lose themselves. They seem almost disinterested in how the trauma has affected them. Both freeze and fawners seem very calm, where fight or flighters seem very agitated. But fawners also want to make sure that you're okay. That's their trauma response. Their response is actually care for others and a disappearance of the self completely. So what that ends up meaning is that there are many, many ways that you can have a trauma response and people not register that you are having a trauma response. And so you need to get to know yourself, and you need to get to think about what you did during your trauma as a way to help you manage what happens inside your body when you have a trigger, so that you can become self-knowledgeable. And as a greater society, we need to become self-knowledgeable about what's happening to other people, because very, very often we pass off, someone is just angry instead of triggered, or someone is too calm, so they can't really be in crisis. We're very, very good at doing these things. And we have to have a better understanding of trauma response in order to help ourselves and to help each other, because it's so common to have all of these responses. And one of the most difficult areas of self-work I personally did was coming to terms with and understanding my personal trauma responses because they made me feel a lot of guilt and shame. My primary response is freeze. And so I've spent a lot of time in that space of going, I don't understand why I didn't react. If you talk to me when I'm not in a trauma or a trigger, I sure don't seem like a person who would move to freeze. And because of that, I couldn't give myself a lot of grace. And I found out that that was really important to work through, that I didn't choose that trauma response. It happened when I was a child. It was a protective measure then, and it remained a protective measure for me through my traumas.
Wow. Thank you for explaining those and also for explaining the fourth response, which many people might not be as familiar with. I think the fight or flight is sort of what most people are familiar with. So that's really great to actually talk about all four of them so we can better understand that. And I can very much relate to you because often after trauma, I feel like I almost don't have a memory of it. And I question, how can that be? It was so intense and so impactful at the time. How can I not remember? And I really have to ask my parents or my sibling or friends what happened at that time if they were there, because I've kind of not have any recollection. And part of that, I think, is the way that we process a trauma response is that we all cope with it in different ways. And sometimes that means that we can have flashbacks, we experience things in different ways. And sometimes those experiences are literally just wiped. So, yeah, very interesting to get to know how you react to different situations and what your responses are in particular.
Yeah. And giving yourself that grace and learning to use the tools that you have so that you do ask. I think it's a great tool that you're willing to ask people what happened and help put that in context, because the one thing we know about all of these trauma responses is that they register in our bodies. They register in our brains. Our brains are amazing tools, in protective in so many ways, in powerful in so many ways, and also not in any way perceptive of what is reality and what is not. And so one of the things that we have to know when we're triggered, when we're experiencing our trauma, is that we have to consciously work with our brain to say, I know that this is happening right now. I know I'm having a trauma response, but it's not real right now. Because your brain doesn't actually know the difference, which means your body doesn't actually know the difference. All of that stuff that gets released, the cortisol, the adrenaline, all of the things that disrupt our sleep, disrupt our mental health, get into our cells and actually our life-shortening responses if we have them too frequently, that all happens regardless of whether, you actually are running from the bear or whether you're just reliving that in a flashback. And so being able to work through that and layering back in those resilience and self-care tools to help you ground yourself, to help shorten that cycle, is really how we do the best to kind of help ourselves start to recover.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I guess that's why a lot of times visualizations work really well, because the brain really can't tell whether what you're thinking about has already happened or whether you're just imagining that.
That's right.
So that's why the visualizations are quite effective, especially as healing tools also. But that's why the brain really just cannot tell the difference between the two, and your body will react as if it is a real experience. So, yeah. Now, you mentioned before that you're an expert companion. And before we talk about what post-traumatic growth is, let's explain to listeners a little bit about what an expert companion is and what they do.
Sure. So this is a term that was introduced by Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who I alluded to earlier, was the writer of the article I read, but has also written several books and done all of the research on post-traumatic growth, which he did in the 90s. And this article in the Harvard Business Review outlined what he termed expert companions, who were people who had been through a trauma, who could essentially partner with other people who've been through traumas and help walk them through a recovery path, walk through an actual growth path so that they don't get stuck and they're not alone. This is different from a therapeutic relationship. And I want to be clear, I'm not a therapist, but I believe in therapy. I think therapists are wonderful people. But as an expert companion, what I'm bringing to anyone who works with me or people I speak with is the experience. So I've grounded some expertise inside my own experiences of not only having the trauma experience, but figuring out how to actually grow and use that experience for a transformation. And that's what I do as an expert companion. So it's a little different and not a term widely used yet, but I'm hoping that we can get more of that because effectively, there are lots of great models. Addiction specialists who have been former addicts, this is a tool for them. Anything in the anonymous category, right? So Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, this is how these models are built. And we don't have anything like that for trauma yet. So I loved that Dr. Tedeschi introduced this term, and that is the role that I have chosen to take on, is expert companion.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. I do wish that that will go a lot further, and hopefully that there will be some recognition for that more globally as trauma expert companions. I think that that could help a lot of people by integrating lived experience into how we help others. So yeah, fantastic. And it sounds like Dr. Tedeschi was really ahead of his time.
Very
So
much so, and it was crazy because this research was done in the 90s and I'd never heard about it. I run into people. I was consulting for an organization in another state and I was in a hotel, in the business center printing, and I happened to be wearing a sweatshirt that says making art is my therapy. And I was carrying a branded bag and this woman came up to me and she'd read these things and she said, "Can I ask you are you a therapist?" Because I'm a therapist. And I said, "No, I'm not." And we engaged in a little conversation and she was an EMDR therapist. So these are, really important therapists that are working in the trauma space. And I started to talk about post-traumatic growth and she had not heard of it. And so I think that that was a really empowering and important moment for me to remember that we have to keep talking about these tools because he was ahead of his time and it still isn't mainstream, even in therapeutic situations where the people there care deeply and are specializing in trauma. They still haven't heard about this practice.
yeah, and that makes sense because we often in therapy or after therapy hear about things like post traumatic stress syndrome and the more negative parts of it. But hardly anyone talks about, can there be a positive outcome after trauma? Can there be growth? Can there be, happiness, joy? Can there be those positive things that we bring forward through experiencing a trauma? And you're right, that does need to be talked about and it does need to be highlighted. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about what post traumatic growth is.
Yeah, so it is such a fascinating concept. As I mentioned, the early research was really Tedeschi and a man named Dr. Lawrence Calhoun looking at the two groups of trauma survivors, effectively those who get stuck in trauma and are very, very limited by it, and those who grow seemingly from it or as a result of it. And it turned out that there was a framework, there were really some steps that people who experienced growth after trauma followed. And what was great about that for me when I read it was that it presented the opportunity for there to be a framework for actual recovery. I've created my own framework. I do a 5-step framework with people that I work with that are called education, loss and limitations, strengths, narratives, and impact. And what I'm really looking at is the boiled down subsets of our trauma, each in one piece at a time. So we take them at one piece at a time, and then we combine them in the narrative step. We combine the little nuggets that we learn along the way to actually rewrite a new narrative for ourselves. And then we figure out how we're going to apply that narrative in what I call impact. They called service. And Tedeschi and Calhoun call that service. I am cautious of that particular word because as a nonprofit executive, as someone who spends a lot of time in the advocacy and service space, and frankly, as someone who's female and who works with a lot of females and female identifying folks, we will impale ourselves on service, and that's not growth. So I use the word impact. And what I'm finding is that if we can, in education, depersonalize the traumatic event, actually remove ourselves from what happened and look at the conditions that lifts a certain amount of our shame and self-limiting language. Then we get the opportunity to really talk about what we lost. And loss is a hard thing. We're very much into this sort of positive vibes only, toxic positivity culture right now, where we don't want to make space for grief or loss. But it's really valid and very freeing. It was one of the largest moments for me was when I could stop feeling guilty for wanting more from my life and could get past the I should just be grateful to be alive kind of message that had been delivered to me, and really mourn what I'd set aside and understand that two things can be true at the same time. I can miss the life I had. I had a marvelous career, a community that I loved, and all of those things were gone. And my new life is beautiful and vibrant and lovely, and I adore it. And also, I can still miss those things. And so we do work in that loss and limitations to both grieve and grow. And then we do a really important step that is a lot of fun, where we get to identify our strengths. And a lot of people who've been through traumas, and especially folks who suffer repeated traumas or have traumas and those have resulted in, or they already have had a mental health condition, they feel very disempowered by the world around them and disempowered by what they bring. So we get to uncover that when you've had these traumas, it actually distills out of you kind of the essence of you, these very great core strengths of yours. And strengths don't necessarily mean aggressive type of things. They can be incredible introspection or incredible perspective that you've gotten, a gift that a lot of people don't have. We get to identify what those are. And then we kind of put those three things together, the conditions, the losses, and the new strengths, and we rewrite a narrative for ourselves. In that narrative, we no longer are the victim, which is a very non-trauma informed word. We are no longer the victim. We are the hero in our story. We get to write our own hero's journey, and we get to self-determine what I call thrivorship, which is that last step of what impact we want this newly minted vision of ourselves and of our lives to actually get to go do. And that impact does not have to be something huge and major. I'm a person who quite literally quit my full-time job and launched into the world of speaking and consulting as part of a post-traumatic growth impact. It's a pretty huge leap. You absolutely don't have to do that. It can be as, seemingly minor, but incredibly important as knowing that you are the person who has a great comfort skill and you take care of your neighbor. It can be the person who has great humor and knows that, you volunteer once a month at the hospital to make people laugh. It doesn't have to be something huge or measurable. It has to have impact to you. And that is thrivorship. And I think when we can transform what happened to us into a tool that empowers us, teaches us who we are, and that who we are has a real positive impact in the world, that's how we grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I love the idea that it doesn't have to end with experiencing trauma, because for some people, that's exactly what it feels like, that will be the rest of their lives hanging over their heads. That's how they have to live. That's how I felt as well. And to know that you can grow through that, you can thrive through trauma, those are things that really give hope, and they open up a really positive way to come out of that and to move forward and through it. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, thank you for letting me do that. I think you're so right that we get stuck and we think, I was asked at a conference once if I would always think of myself as a survivor. And, it's a binary for me. Either I'm a survivor or I'm not. So yes, I always think of myself as a survivor, but I also think of myself as a thriver. I think of myself as somebody who's transformed from that moment in a positive way. And, I laid out a very simple framework. It's not simple to navigate. It takes a lot of time. Use a lot of your resilience and self-care tools along the way because they're not always easy. And it doesn't always walk through directly in those steps in order. But I think it's important to know that there is healing and there is the opportunity for joy and for light. And, for those of us who've been through traumas, we have seen some of the darkest moments of humanity. We have seen some of the darkest moments of ourselves. But what that allows us to do is also understand that we can therefore see and value the brighter moments in ways other people never will be able to. And so striving to transform and find more of those bright paths is, I think, a way to really thrive in life, and something that I want trauma survivors to know that they're entitled to. It's not even something that you should think it would be nice if. I would love, if you've suffered a trauma and you're feeling very stuck, for you to know that you deserve to have that bright light. You deserve to have that joy, not just to be able to take the small steps, although those small steps matter so much. Keep taking the small steps so that you can get to the bigger ones too, because you are absolutely entitled to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Thank you. And that puts a whole new perspective on when trauma happens and how we live afterwards and how we can choose to move forward as well. That choice sometimes seems like it's taken away depending on where we end up, maybe in the system. So
Yes.
that can definitely be the case. And I do want to touch on one little thing as well, because we are talking about moving forward from trauma. And oftentimes that puts us in situations where we come in contact with public services or healthcare services or other professional services that we are either referred to or we end up working with. And you and I spoke about how there still seems to be quite a lack of trauma-informed language and even just lack of trauma-informed care that happens in these situations. So do you want to speak a little bit as to what trauma-informed language is and how that could maybe be incorporated into some of the services and that are offered to trauma survivors?
Absolutely. It's so important. And I think you allude to a very real situation. I want to also be clear that when we are going through post-traumatic growth, when we're going through our traumas, when we're practicing resilience and self-care, we are doing these things largely to create the armor around ourselves and for ourselves to help us continue to work and fight through a system that isn't really set up for us. Right? Even though there are resources, whether there are healthcare resources, housing resources, all of these things, we know a lot of the services we need are disjointed systemically. It's kind of a mess. Financially, there are impacts. Physically, on your body, there are impacts. And so doing that health and wellness piece is really, really important. And you may find yourself needing that when you reach out to services, because far too often, even those services who are supposed to be helpful or advocate for us, they are also not informed about things like trauma-informed language. And so one of the most common things that happened to me when I speak about what happened is someone almost inevitably would come up to me at the end and say, "Oh my goodness, you must just be so grateful to be here." The other one I hear frequently is, "Well, everything happens for a reason." And these kinds of phrases, which you might also be saying to yourself or someone along the way who may be well-intentioned, is saying those kinds of things to you. Those kinds of phrases actually take our agency and diminish our feelings. And when we ingrain those thought processes in ourselves, because we've heard other people say them or talk about them, we limit ourselves, our ability to express ourselves, our ability to grow from them. And so if you are in a situation where you are an advocate for somebody, or if you are working in an advocacy organization, it's really important to not diminish or take agency from your survivors. In the US, at least, when I was living in shelters, one of the big things that happened was I was living in a shelter and I got this big stack of paperwork. And, you're already overwhelmed and there's probably 20 pages of paperwork. And the top of every page says victims services. Now, if you want to empower me, the way to do that is not to put the word victim on top of 20 pages I'm going to have to fill out. And understanding that, doing the best we can with our language at the time, those kinds of phrases and labels self-limit what's happening. Trauma-informed language addresses both the validity of emotions, even negative ones, and the validity of the agency of the person who's been affected by the trauma. So we don't say everything happens for a reason, because if that's the case, I didn't have any agency over what happened to me, which may be true. But it also indicates I don't have any agency over how to get better. And so instead, we need to be honoring spaces by saying what you've been through was not in your control, but what you are going to do now is, and framing things up in a way that honors the agency of the person who survived. We also need to personalize our language. So I think even referring, I never refer to myself or anyone else as a victim. I think that's a terribly negative term. I even limit the word survivor a little bit. And I think for advocates and for people who are responding, I know that they are taught to depersonalize because it limits their own vicarious trauma. But when interacting with a trauma survivor, using their name, using their appropriate pronouns, those things help to ground and personalize someone. And if you don't want them to have a trauma response and you need them to be useful, personalizing is really the only way you're going to be able to do that. So I think we have to be cautious of the platitudes that we've heard. I think we have to be very cautious of telling people things like, you choose your attitude, as opposed to saying things like, your healing doesn't have a timeline, and that's a lot to carry. Those are really trauma-informed responses to when someone says they're having a very hard time, as opposed to someone saying to someone, that's an old story, you need to get over it, which is really diminishing or disempowering how they're feeling. So trauma-informed language centers on the individual who's been through a trauma, and it centers on this idea of what happened to you and not on a response that allows us to ignore what did happen to someone. There's a lot of work to be done in trauma-informed language, and there's a lot of noise in the greater society that, especially on social media, that is very non-trauma informed. And, I think when you're seeing the memes, no healing journey is going to get fixed by a meme. It just isn't.
Yes.
So, right, when you see one of those, when you see the you chose your attitude today, you know what? If you have clinical depression, you did not. That's just fundamentally not true. And if you're having a bad day, you can have a bad day, and that doesn't make you a person unworthy of being around people or make you somehow reduced because you're having a bad day. Not being allowed to express those things will limit you and increase your bad days. So find people who can allow you to express yourself, find ways to express yourself. And if you've said those kinds of platitudes before, I adopt Maya Angelou's attitude, when we know better, we do better. I most certainly have used that language on myself and on other people I loved with the best of intentions. But now knowing that it doesn't help, I try to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where your education and you sharing your story and talking about this really helps, because you're actually now lifting the veil, let's say, on trauma and what happens when you thrive through trauma, which are oftentimes things we don't like talking about, and not many people do talk about it. So yeah, I do appreciate your perspective on this, what you have experienced and how you have thrived through this trauma, and what you are now bringing to the public and saying, hey, we should change some things, and here's some information on that, because it is so needed in pretty much all of the areas that get touched by, services, by the medical community, everything that's involved when trauma survivors actually come forward or they come into the system. And it's much needed changes there, for sure.
Yeah. And I think for service providers are so grateful for so many of them. I most certainly wouldn't be here right now without them, but it is a system that continues to need improvement. It's a system where the people who are in it also need self-care and resilience tools. They also need supports. I think talking to advocates, talking to others and saying, when someone's in a trauma and you are one of the responders, if you thought about the fact that you were going to leave, a permanent mark on them with your words, what words would you choose to say? You stop being quite so flippant with the kinds of language that we use if we think about it as a permanent mark. And the thing is about when we are having those trauma responses, when we've either been in trauma or we've been re-traumatized, very often those things do leave a permanent mark. And that's what people like you and I and other people listening have to end up working to get over is, I had an attorney, my own attorney, encouraged me to drop a restraining order I had. And the phrase he used was, "You have a judge who doesn't like adversarial women."
Oh,
And,
really?
in the middle of me fighting for my well being, my life, my safety, the notion that that made me adversarial it was a really big mark. It was something that I had to continue to work through. And still sometimes, it will pop into my head. And so I encourage people to be a little more conscious of that language that they're using. And you can start this even with children, right? We've learned to do things like children fall down and then we say, get up, you're fine, you're fine. We diminish right away. We teach them right away that whatever they're feeling needs to be put back under wraps and put back under control. Instead of saying, wow, that was a big fall. Are you feeling okay about that? Or, wow, that, I saw that happen. Let's take a breath. I think it's going to be okay. And helping them to frame up, like, how are you feeling? What are you doing? And giving them that minute to, one, acknowledge what happened, and two, to process. If we start doing that with children, hopefully by the time they're adults like we are, they'll have done that enough that when the bigger things happen, when it's not just falling down at the playground, they're able to both respond to the people around them and to themselves by saying, I'm carrying a lot right now. I need a minute. I need to talk to somebody. I need a break, without that being some kind of taboo weakness that we've instilled in, even little tiny toddlers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does speak a little bit also to personal boundaries and really saying, look, I've kind of reached this boundary that I'm comfortable with. I need to gather my resources. I need to refocus on what I need. I just need a few moments. And even that, sometimes it's hard for us to express that when we're adults, to say, this day has really gotten to me. I need a few minutes to recenter. I need a few minutes to bring my resources back and maybe do some self-care. And that also, I find, falls by the wayside a lot of the times, that we're just not allowed or not able to express those personal boundaries where we need some space. So very important to start that early.
Yeah. And we've diminished this whole notion of like taking care of ourselves or any kind of inability to temporarily perform, right? Because it's temporary. You're not saying, I need to permanently walk away from this place. You're saying, I need a minute to gather myself. I need some time to get this back together. It's been so ingrained in us that that's a weakness, instead of the idea that if you are a person who can do that, just brava, my hat's off to you, because that is such an amazing gift of self-acknowledgement. And I wish that in our organizations, in our communities, in our society, we were putting more value on that, because the person who can healthily do that, if you can healthily say, I need my time for self-care right now, you are more productive. You are a better person in society. You are a better employee. You're a better partner, spouse, parent, friend, whatever it is you are in the world, you're better if you can do that. And, I know for myself, that's one of those areas I continue to really struggle with, because it's been in my head that, I have to fight, I have to fight, I have to fight. I have to work, I have to produce. I have to do these things that you learn to ignore the rest of those signals that your body is giving you and your mind is giving you, that you need this break. And it's so important in trauma-informed care, and so important in a greater trauma-informed society to be able to do that. It's actually the healthy side of trauma responses. So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn all have healthy responses. And the healthy response, the healthy fight response, is actually boundaries, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think the information that you are providing today on this podcast, there's so many things that I have learned as well, and that are so helpful, that I'm really grateful that you're here talking about that. So thank you for that. And can you go over some of your programs and services that you offer so that listeners could get a feel for how they could connect with you or work with you in their journey?
Of course. So I do speaking, consulting, and coaching. So I work with organizations as well as individuals and in groups and in one-on-one settings. So I do with the one-on-one coaching space, which usually if you're listening to me as a podcast, you're probably an individual. I do some one-on-one coaching, usually all via Zoom. So I can serve folks anywhere in the world. I also run some workshops and webinars, some things called the 2-hour toolkit occasionally. So I do some on resilience. And I'm getting ready to release a couple of e-courses so that people can get that information asynchronous in their own time, maybe in their own time zone, and when they are feeling ready, with some additional individual support if you need it. But you can find me at myles2go.net, and I'm MYLES, myles2go.net, where you can see all of the different services that I offer. You can also join my email list there. And if you do, I've got a free download on trauma-informed language. Actually, it's called 20 Things Not to Say, 12 Things to Try Instead, and Why. And so that would be your free download. And then you'll be on my newsletter list. So you'll be able to see the different activities and spaces that I'm speaking in, whether it's podcasts or summits, or whether I'm going to be coming to your community, which I love to do to be able to reach out to people. So join me there. If you are a social media person, I am on Facebook at Speaks Myles, and I am on Instagram at Myles.2 and the word go.
Amazing. And we will be linking to all of Nichole's offerings in the show notes as well. So you can take a look there on how to connect with her directly. And this has been another incredible episode. And I really hope our listeners have connected with your story, Nichole, and your experiences as much as I have. It has been a privilege chatting with you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Petra, thank you for having me on the journey. I'm so happy to be here. And I hope I have helped your listeners today because it's been so great to have the opportunity to share.
Yeah. And I hope you continue sharing in lots and lots of places and also continue advocating for things like the companion that we were talking about, the expert companion for trauma. And I'm very curious to see how that all goes forward. So thank you again so much and take care, Nichole.
Same to you, Petra. Take care.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please subscribe, share on social media, and leave us a review. And be sure to get your copy of our brand new ebook called Break Free. Sending you love and courage, and see you next week. Until then, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and the Journey blog.